Welcome to Hatman Strikes Back Daily Boxing News. Shout out to everybody in the chat. We got a couple of things to talk about today. Obviously, the heavyweight fight card on the weekend, not as stacked as it originally was because of some pullouts. Obviously, you had Dillian Whyte pulling out with an injury, but he was replaced by a better fighter anyway, in my opinion, than Hrgovic. But there was supposed to be Richard Riakporhe, Lawrence Okolie on the card, which I personally was looking forward to. That is no longer happening. Moses Itama was also originally, well, not originally, but after Whyte pulled out, Itama was one of the people who they were trying to bolster the card with, but he's not fighting on the card either. Still, there's a couple of heavyweight fights on there which I find interesting, which we will get onto. But speaking of heavyweights, I just want to plug the Patreon here. So I just uploaded a George Foreman film study to my Patreon page. You can see it here on screen. It is 3 hours long, a few seconds shy of that. And in this film study, as the title suggests, I analyze video footage, not still shots like I do on YouTube. On Patreon, I actually use the video footage. 3 hours of me analyzing some of the most significant fights in George Foreman's career and breaking down his style and explaining why he was so effective. Because yes, he was a big puncher and a brute and all that, but there was actually method to the madness. George Foreman is seen as this wild, swinging caveman type fighter, especially back in the 70s, but he was a lot more cerebral and a lot more clever and crafty than people give him credit for. So I reveal all that in this 3 hour marathon George Foreman bonanza on Patreon, all right? So check out this latest boxing film study on Patreon. And when you sign up for my Patreon, you'll get access to all the other content on there, which is obviously dependent on the tier you sign up for. But this particular video is available as part of my Boxing Brotherhood tier. As you can see, it's very reasonably priced. There's no contract, there's no commitment. It works just the same as Netflix. If you want to sign up for only a month, you can do that and then cancel, no problem whatsoever. There's no like long-term contract or anything like that. So head on over to my Patreon page, select the tier called the Boxing Brotherhood, and then you'll gain access to this boxing film study about George Foreman, which was just uploaded moments before this stream started, as well as many, many others. And lots of podcast material and all sorts of other stuff I've done on Patreon under the Boxing Brotherhood tier. You can see some of the previous film studies I've done on the likes of Tommy Hearns, Riddick Bowe, Mike Tyson, etc., etc., etc. All right, so make sure you check it out on Patreon, George Foreman Film Study. Get access to all the other content on there as well as the Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. So yeah, check me out on Patreon. Okay, so let's move on to this weekend's heavyweight fight card. Now, it was originally stacked with more heavyweight fights. Not so many of them now. I think maybe just 3 or 4. There is Delicious Ori, and I always kind of cringe when I have to say his name because it's such a weird name. His dad apparently named him Delicious, which is bizarre, but I guess it's the kind of Nigerian thing of picking random words out of the Bible and then naming their kids with those random words. I guess delicious is a word that's used in the Bible here and there in a very different way to the way people would use the word today. Do you know what I mean? So that's why it comes across as really weird. So I'm not particularly interested in Ori's debut. I watched him in the Olympics. To me, there wasn't anything particularly impressive by what I saw. He might be another Tony Yoka, but perhaps he'll prove me wrong. I'm no Nostradamus here. I've been wrong about fighters in the past. Maybe I'll be wrong about Delicious Ori, but from what I've seen so far, his talent doesn't jump out at me. Okay? I don't know how you guys feel. But I am interested in the main event, Joyce versus Filip Hrgovic. I think it's a better fight than Joyce Whyte was going to be. Personally, after both of their recent fights, Joyce losing to Derek Chisora and Dillian Whyte fighting Ebenezer Tete, even though Whyte won and Joyce lost, I was still picking Joyce. because Tete, seriously, folks, was terrible. And anyone who thinks that guy's in their 30s in his 30s, is very naive indeed. Tete, I think, is close to 50 in reality. So many of these African athletes have got fake ages, right? This shouldn't be a revelation to anybody. Yeah, many of them got fake ages. And in my estimation, Tete is one of them. That guy looks close to 50 to me. In his 30s, I think that's laughable. And Dillian Whyte looked terrible against Ebenezer Tete. Absolutely terrible. And that's a Ebenezer Tete who several years prior had been blitzed and around by Dubois. I know styles make fights, but Dillian Whyte's punches didn't seem to have any effect on Tete. That's concerning. Dillian Whyte looked as slow as molasses. He's never been a particularly fast heavyweight. His left hook used to have some zip on it. But yeah, that Tete fight was a shocker. Dillian Whyte looked terrible. We've also got David Adeleye versus Jamie Tshikeva. I'm looking forward to this fight. A domestic one. 10 rounds, heavyweights. And this was, vacant British heavyweight title. I was just looking there on the BoxRec graphic here for where it stated that it was for the vacant British heavyweight title, which Fabio Wardley has now vacated. And indeed it is. So domestic scrap between David Adeleye and Jamie Tshikeva. They're at similar stages of their careers. They've had similar careers so far, truth be told. Although David Adeleye lost to a more proven and better fighter than the guy that Jamie Tshikeva lost to. Tshikeva lost to some random Brazilian. Whereas, of course, David Adeleye lost to Fabio Wardley, who's gone on to bigger and better things. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to these fights. Before we get on to my analysis and my prediction on these fights, let's get to your questions and comments. All right? Shout out to everybody in the chat. And as always, if you guys can stick a like on this stream, it really helps by way of the algorithm getting these streams seen so they appear further up in searches and what have you. Shout out to Chili Beef. Big up, big up. Shout out to Fight Sport Talk. Shout out to Femi's Little Dark Room. Funny name. He says, Joyce has beaten Hrgovic in the amateurs twice. Is it twice? I was only aware of him beating him once, and that was in the WSB, which isn't quite amateur. It's like a halfway house between amateur and pro boxing. WSB, I did see that fight. That was a good fight. Beat him on points. I'm not aware of him beating him a second time. Prior to that or after that, tell me about it, since I don't know about it. Shout out to Evil Uncle Phil, G-Man in the chat. Shout out to Hasbol. He says, how did Joyce beat Dubois? Styles make fights. And Joyce really used his experience against Dubois. Dubois came in very anxious against Joyce, and that basically backfired. Kyle, shout out to him. He says, surely Ori has a Nigerian middle name you can go by, hopefully. Shout out to Jake for the super chat. He says, did you hear the rumors Johnny Fisher being an iron? Somebody said this the other day, and it's a little surprising to me because he doesn't come across that way, but not all of them do. A lot of the old school ones didn't come across that way. So, hey, if he is. That's his business. You know what I mean? That's his business. But yeah, I never heard those rumors up until somebody mentioned it in the chat the other day. So shout out to Jake for the super chat. Evil Uncle Phil says Tete and Luis Ortiz both doing well for 60-year-olds. Shout out to Robo Roberts. Tony, big up. Martin Wood Wilkinson. Yes, yes. He says, do you agree that Hrgovic was beaten by Triple D headbutts? I seem to remember him saying, by any means necessary, which I guess involved the head. No, I don't agree with that. I think that Hrgovic punched himself out. And Dubois, having good stamina, was able to come on strong. There were cuts there. Maybe the head contributed, but I don't think Hrgovic lost purely because of cuts. I think that he, as I say, punched himself out. He actually did an interview. Let me check which channel it's on, because I do recommend you guys watch it if you haven't seen it. He did an interview with, let me see here, Box Nation. So go over to the Box Nation YouTube channel and look at their recently uploaded videos and have a look at the interview they did with Filip Hrgovic. And he says he had a lot of issues in the run-up to the fight. He says he was ill. And speaking of Johnny Fisher, since somebody just mentioned him, Johnny Fisher was part of Hrgovic's camp for the Daniel Dubois fight. And he said a few months ago that Hrgovic overdid it in camp and that Hrgovic was ill and whatnot. So Hrgovic never said that himself. He wasn't the first person to say that himself. Johnny Fisher said it. Now, I'm not making any excuses for Hrgovic, but I'm just, relaying this because he said it himself, after Fisher had said it months prior. He said it himself in the interview that he did with Box Nation. And he just said that he didn't have the strength to continue attacking Dubois the way he wanted to in the first few rounds. But for me, again, and he also admitted to underestimating Dubois. Yeah, he thought that as soon as he started opening up on him, Dubois would crumble, and he obviously didn't. So he admitted to underestimating him. He really didn't speak much about headbutt. I think he might have mentioned it in passing, but he didn't lean into this idea that he lost just because of headbutts. No, he said more it was because he lost his strength and he couldn't maintain the work rate and that Dubois was just tougher than he anticipated. And so that's what I think it was. Hrgovic should have been more sensible with his punch output. He threw, I think, nearly 100 punches in the first round and the second round. It's crazy for a heavyweight that size to be throwing that number of punches. And he just punched himself out, and that allowed Dubois back into the fight. It happens. So that's my take on it. But shout out to you, sir, as always. Kyle says, Hatman, have you seen Dwyer claiming that Jake Paul has the legs to beat AJ? Well, I did see Dwyer upload the video. And Dwyer often gets things backwards, or sometimes gets things backwards. And he seems to think that AJ wants to delay the fight and have it next year. But from the interviews I've seen, it's actually Jake Paul that wants to delay the fight and have it next year, not AJ. Jake Paul is saying he wants the fight in 2026. So I'm not sure why Dwyer's got the wires crossed. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me that he said he thinks Jake Paul's got the legs to beat AJ. I think it's a complete mismatch. Total mismatch. AJ wins that fight easily. I mean, if he won the Ngannou fight easily, and I predicted that he'd beat Ngannou comfortably and have no problems, against Jake Paul, it's just going to be a farce. If that fight takes place, it'll be a farce. Maybe Jake Paul will run away, but he has absolutely no chance as far as I'm concerned against Anthony Joshua. None. It'll be an absolute joke. For a different reason than the Jake Paul-Mike Tyson fight was a joke. Because for that fight, people were expecting Tyson to be competitive. And Tyson was obviously a 60-year-old man coming off many decades of bad living, bunning weed and all sorts of other stuff. I don't know what people expected. But the Anthony Joshua-Jake Paul fight would be a farce for another reason, and that would be because Jake Paul is just not competitive. But yeah, Dwyer likes to throw curveballs at you and give massive underdogs a better shot than they really have. One of the funniest Dwyer predictions, and shout out to Dwyer, by the way. I like Dwyer. I'm subscribed to Dwyer. I watch his videos on a regular basis. This is not a shot at Dwyer, right? Even though he has some strange takes, right? That's part of the entertainment for me. I like Dwyer, so big him up. But one of his funniest predictions was when he picked Rod Salka to beat Danny Garcia. Not sure how many of you guys remember that one. He picked Rod Salka to beat Danny Garcia. And there was another funny Dwyer take is when Artur Beterbiev fought some guy quite early on in his career. I can't remember the guy's name. And the fight only went 2 rounds, right? And there was a little fake knockdown in the fight where Beterbiev tripped over a foot or something like that happened. But I can't remember if it actually got counted as a knockdown. But watching it at the time, to me, it wasn't a knockdown, right? Anyway, that was the only little bit of fake success that the opponent had in the fight. Then Beterbiev crushed him in the second round. And I remember Dwyer's post-fight review, he was saying that the guy that got beaten, the Beterbiev opponent, impressed him more than Beterbiev did. He was making it out as though that guy had a higher ceiling than Beterbiev. I was like, yo, Dwyer's wild. He's wild sometimes. But that's part of the charm of Dwyer, you know, for me anyway. It's some of the wild takes. Shout out to Bob. Shout out to Mr. Luca as always. Shout out to Austin Spears. Thomas Leonard. Cloud. Marley. And so on. All right. So now let me give you my take on, first of all, let's go Adeleye TKV. So, as I said earlier on, both relatively young heavyweights. Adeleye, the younger of the two. At, 28 years of age. Jamie TKV's 31. Both guys have got a loss on their record. I think that David Adeleye is going to win this fight. TKV, there's apparently a lot of talk in the gyms that he performs very well in sparring. Is he another Martin Bakole? We'll see about that. But he hasn't impressed me in any of his fights so far in the pros. Not that I saw any of his amateur bouts, but with Martin Bakole, at least he had some impressive performances in the ring. I haven't seen anything in the ring of Jamie TKV that made me sit up and think, okay, this guy could be a serious player. So maybe this is the fight where he produces it. We shall see. Based upon what I have seen, I've got to go with David Adeleye. Now, the only reservation I have about Adeleye here is his stamina. It might be possible that TKV, who isn't so muscular as David Adeleye, not that Adeleye is massively heavy, even though he's a muscular guy, he's not like a really, really heavy fighter. But there's the possibility that Adeleye has a stamina issue. Now, I actually don't think Adeleye gets enough credit for the success he had against Fabio Wardley, because even when I watched it live, I thought it was, other than the first round or so, a fairly straightforward win for Fabio Wardley. But watching it again recently, and the fight's available to watch on YouTube, folks, you know, it's easy to access. That was actually a far more competitive fight than I remember. And even in, I think, the penultimate round, Adeleye was landing good shots and having success. He's a very explosive fighter. He's got that fast left hook that laid waste to Solomon Dakers. In his last fight, he knocked out Dakers in a round. He's athletic. He can box on the back foot, front foot. He prefers to stick and move. You know, he's not like hypermobile, but he likes to walk you onto shots and set traps and stuff like that. Work off his jab. Lead with power shots at times. He's a relatively dynamic fighter. And I just think Jamie TKV is going to be a bit too basic, a bit too predictable, and Adeleye will be able to get him under control. Maybe stop him. We'll see how tough TKV is. But if Adeleye runs out of gas, and remember, according to BoxRec, it's scheduled for 10, and the longest that Adeleye has been, I think, was, 6 or 7 with Fabio Wardley. If he gasses out, maybe TKV comes on strong and gives Adeleye the second defeat of his career. But yeah, I got Adeleye in this one. I just think he's more talented. I think he hits harder. He's faster. He's sharper. He's got that swag about him, which some people don't like. Personally, I like to see a fighter with swag that has confidence. And, you know, some people say maybe it's false confidence to some extent. Sometimes you have a level of confidence, but without the experience, there is some underlying anxiety. And I think that maybe was the case with Adeleye in the Wardley fight. There was a little bit of underlying anxiety because, again, he hadn't been in with anybody before. But I think the confidence is real. He just needs to galvanize it with, more fights under his belt, more experience and what have you. And, I think that confidence will allow him to make the most out of his potential, whatever that potential actually is, however good you guys estimate it to be. He's with Adam Booth now, of course. And I think that's a good pairing because Adam Booth does like working with these athletic fighters, explosive fighters, because they're the ones who can pull off the moves that he teaches them. So, I got Adeleye in this one. I'll throw it over to the chat. How do you see this fight going? Do you see Adeleye winning or Jamie TKV? Chili Beef has got Adeleye too. Temper notch. Stockholm's got Adeleye. Martin Wood Wilkinson, Adeleye by early stoppage. Kyle says, David will be in a title fight soon. He's got a Dylan White ceiling. Okay. Cloud says David on points. So, mostly people picking Adeleye. Bob's got Adeleye as well. Okay, Evil Uncle Phil is going for TKV. He says, I think an upset based on their sparring history. What is their sparring history? Enlighten me, please. I haven't watched the face-off between them. I'm not sure if the sparring history was mentioned there. Any guy says, really hope TKV wins, but can't see it happening. Stockholm says, never seen the other guy. And Adeleye could become heavyweight champ at some point, so looks like a mismatch, to be honest. JR says Adeleye late stoppage. Michael Thompson says Adeleye KO. Up North says never seen TKB. It's actually TKV fight, so can't really comment. Bob says they mentioned sparring at the kickstarting press conference, if I remember well. And what was said about the sparring? Cloud says, I think a close fight. Both get tired in the later rounds. And I guess you meant to say UD for Dave. So it's pretty much not quite unanimous, but nearly in the chat for David Adeleye. All right, let's move on to the main event then. Joyce versus Filip Hrgovic. The Juggernaut versus El Animal. Now, both guys coming off losses, so it's a crossroads fight of sorts, but Hrgovic has got more life in him. He's certainly a lot younger, so he could potentially afford to lose another fight and still have enough time to get himself back in title contention. Not that he wants to lose this fight, you understand. Whereas Joyce is really at last chance saloon, especially the type of opponent he lost to last time out in Derek Chisora. And of course, he had those 2 stoppage defeats to Zheli Zhang. Hrgovic coming in at relatively short notice. He's at about a month to know that he was going to fight Joyce, there or thereabouts. But according to Abel Sanchez, who's training him now, he's been in Big Bear for quite a while, for several months, ticking over in the gym, getting used to Abel Sanchez as his coach. So he should be in pretty good shape. This should not be a Martin Bakole, Joseph Parker situation. We should see Filip Hrgovic turn up on the scales and be, a decent weight. There was footage posted on his Instagram account of him running in the snow, Rocky Balboa style. So, it should be a decent version of Filip Hrgovic, a pretty good version. I think it's a good pairing with Abel Sanchez because Abel Sanchez will focus on really turning the screw and improving Hrgovic's power Hrgovic, and this is something that somebody said in the live chat a few streams ago, he appears to be an individual who thinks that he hits a lot harder than he actually does. You know, he goes out there and fights like he's the biggest puncher in the world, but he's not really. So Abel Sanchez, I think, will help him to not necessarily realize his dream as being one of the biggest punchers in the world, but the power that he does have, I think Sanchez can help to elevate it with the punch training techniques that he uses, particularly with Golovkin and what have you. And again, just to give a little plug for this video I uploaded on Patreon today, the George Foreman film study. I start off the film study talking about how conventional wisdom with your average boxing coach doesn't really lend itself to really developing punching power, in my opinion. If you look at fighters like George Foreman, Mike Tyson, and so on the bag, now George Foreman and Mike Tyson on the bag, very different, but both of them, from the footage you'll see, did not hit the bag in the way that your average boxing coach will tell you to hit the bag, which is to throw a million punches and work rate, work rate, work rate. No. They focused far more on power and quality over quantity. They were not trying to throw a million punches around on the bag. Even Mike Tyson, he would throw short combinations, then he'd move around, move his head, then he'd throw another short combination. That's how he used to hit the bag. But whenever he would throw those combinations, they would be with full power every time. Okay? So it was very, very power focused. And that is how you develop power, folks. You know, if you want to hit hard in the ring, you need to be hitting the bag hard, and you need to be doing it a lot. So in this George Foreman film study, I start off showing some footage of him hitting the bag in a way which would be considered unconventional by most coaches, and most coaches will tell you, no, don't hit the bag like that. Well, George Foreman knew what he was doing, obviously. So I start off with that, and then I go through 3 hours of George Foreman fight film, where I'm pointing out certain things as far as Foreman's boxing brain and the way that he would set up knockout punches. He was far more cerebral and clever than people give him credit for. So yeah, check out my George Foreman film study, 3 hours long, just uploaded on Patreon. You also get access to my entire back catalog of content as well. If you sign up for the boxing tier, there are loads of other film studies, which are, you know, very, very long film studies, loads of other content on there, podcasts and whatnot. So head on over to the Patreon page and select the tier called The Boxing Brotherhood. No contract, no commitment. You can cancel at any time, just like Netflix. If you want to sign up just for a month and then quit, you can do that, all right? Anyway, back to the matter at hand, Joyce, Filip Hrgovic. With a guy like Abel Sanchez, I think that he can develop Filip Hrgovic's power. He certainly was able to get the best out of Gennady Golovkin. Obviously, Golovkin was always a tremendous puncher. But Golovkin used to throw, as you guys will remember, these weird shots which would come over the top of the opponent's glove and actually hit them on the top of the head, sometimes on the forehead. George Foreman used to throw those kind of shots as well, even back in the 70s. But in the 80s and into the 90s as well, when he had his second career. Hrgovic, we saw it in the Daniel Dubois fight, is very good at varying the trajectory of his right hands. And that's something I actually underestimated going into the Dubois-Joshua fight. I thought, well, if Hrgovic is catching Dubois that easily with the right hand, AJ, who's a more explosive puncher than Hrgovic, and for me, a better counter puncher, surely he'll be able to do an even better job. And Dubois is not going to be able to revamp his defense overnight. But in retrospect, and that's one of the things I did a film study on Patreon. You get access to that as well if you sign up for my Patreon on the boxing tier. In retrospect, when I did that film study, I looked at the Hrgovic-Dubois fight again, and in that first round, you see Hrgovic varying the angle of his right hand. He initially starts throwing it straight, but then Dubois has got his left hand out to block the straight shots. Then Hrgovic starts chopping it over the top of Dubois' left hand that's blocking the straight shots. He starts chopping it over the top. So he's varying the angle of it right away in the first round. Then when Dubois starts raising his arm to block that one, Hrgovic is then coming up the middle with the uppercut. And that's why he was able to land so many right hands on Daniel Dubois, or one of the reasons, because he kept varying the trajectory of the shot. And also because he's got a very good chin, Hrgovic, he's not afraid to punch with Dubois. AJ was terrified of punching with Dubois because he knew he didn't have the chin to be able to stand there and exchange. Whereas Hrgovic is very confident in his chin, so he was able to stand and punch with Dubois early doors, and he actually got the better of it. Yeah, Dubois only started taking control of the fight when Hrgovic began to tire because of all the shots he was throwing. But skill for skill, in terms of who is more cultured at landing their power shots, Hrgovic was better than Dubois. In terms of, again, punch picking and skill at landing their shots, Hrgovic showed he was the more skilled operator. But he was a bit too overeager. He didn't respect Dubois enough. He still looked at him as a little boy, the guy that he stopped in sparring however many years ago. And he thought that the memories, the ghosts of those sparring sessions would come flooding back into Dubois' mind and he would crumble. Hrgovic is a very alpha personality. You know, a bit of a bully in the ring and whatnot. And he had a rude awakening because a little kid that used to bully in sparring was able to stand up to him and repel his attacks. So, yeah, that is what that is. But I think that Hrgovic is fresher than Joyce. I think that, yes, he did lose to Joyce in the WSB. Somebody said he lost to Joyce twice. I was only aware of the one fight they had. Perhaps there was another. I'm just not aware of it. That fight was competitive. Joyce stuck it on Filip Hrgovic. He bullied him and he outworked him. It's possible that Joyce could do it again, but he's much slower now. And Joyce has never been fast, but he's much, much slower now than he was when he fought in the WSB. I think Hrgovic is slightly slower as well, but he hasn't lost as much speed, for my money, as Joyce has. So I'm taking Filip Hrgovic to win this fight on points. I'm certainly not counting Joyce out because, again, styles make fights. Even though I think Hrgovic is the fresher guy, he's certainly the younger guy. He's not as shop-worn as a pro. So, yeah, I can't count Joyce out because of the style thing. But I just feel as though Hrgovic is going to take it. So, that's me. Hrgovic winning this fight on points. What say you? And give me your rationale for picking who you're picking. Shout out to Mr. Luca for the super chat. He says, how the hell does Dwyer think Paul can beat AJ? Well, to be fair, he thought that Mike Tyson was going to come out with all sorts of combinations and look spectacular against Jake Paul. So, you know. Now, Michael Thompson says, took Hrgovic 12 rounds to get rid of McKean and then fought Demori. Yeah, taking 12 rounds to get rid of McKean is not great, but fighting Demori, I got no problem with that because Hrgovic had become mandatory. So if you're mandatory, you don't really need to do anything other than just wait for your shot. Ultimately, he didn't do that, right? He was offered a load of money by the Saudis and he fought Daniel Dubois, so he risked his mandatory and the risk didn't pay off. But once you fought yourself into a mandatory position, I've got no issue with a fighter just treading water and having a few knockover jobs until the mandatory gets called. I got no issue with that. And as I say, he decided to risk his mandatory after the Demori fight by fighting Daniel Dubois. But shout out to Mr. Luca. Yeah, how the hell does Dwyer think Paul can beat AJ? Well, Dwyer likes to keep us entertained. Shout out to him. Shout out to Jackie Boy Johnson. Bob says, Hrgovic will land at will, but he'd better pace himself against Joyce. who has a good gas tank. I also think Joyce's jab and footwork are better. I would tend to agree with the jab. Footwork. Joyce used to have pretty good footwork, but we haven't seen it for a while, have we? We haven't really seen Joyce's footwork since maybe the Dubois fight. A little bit of it in the Zhang rematch, but it didn't pay off. So we haven't seen Joyce's footwork for a while. Maybe at his age, the footwork ain't what it used to be, you know? KS is asking about Adeleye TKV. Yeah, we just spoke about that a few minutes prior. If you just rewind the stream, you'll hear me speaking about that. Any guy says, got a feeling Joyce stops him and shocks everyone. Don't think Joyce is 100% back, but he's looked in better shape recently. Hey, it's heavyweight boxing. You cannot count really many people out in the top 10 at heavyweight. If you think these guys are top 10 anyway. Shazar says Hrgovic doesn't respond well to punches. He looks like a deer in the headlights when he gets hit and freezes. Joyce's work rate will win it, I think. I disagree with that. I don't think Hrgovic does freeze when he gets hit at all. He got hit with big shots early against Daniel Dubois and he didn't freeze whatsoever. I think he just gets tired, is what it is. I don't think there's any freezing going on. He just gets tired. Adam says Hrgovic definitely has bad stamina, gassed against Zhang, Triple D, and the Australian fella. I wouldn't necessarily say he's got bad stamina. He doesn't have Joyce stamina. Let's just get that straight. I wouldn't say he has bad stamina. I would say that he doesn't pace himself well. Like the person on a previous stream said, he fights like a guy who thinks he's a massive puncher when he's not. So he comes out early and he tries to blitz you and just overdoes it with the work rate in the early rounds. That's what Hrgovic tends to do. That's certainly what he did against Triple D. And also, Dempsey McKean. He was throwing the kitchen sink at McKean in the early rounds. He doesn't pace himself. Kyle says Hrgovic doesn't pace himself because he's nervous. Yeah, I don't think he is nervous. I think it's actually the opposite. I think he's overconfident because he does fancy himself as this big bully boy puncher. And maybe he needs to learn to be a bit more technical and break fighters down over the long haul. I don't think it's about nerves, personally. I mean, I'm not in the guy's mind, but personally, I don't think it's about nerves. He was a vastly experienced amateur, vastly experienced in the WSB. He's a very confident, alpha-type personality. So I think his issue is the opposite. I think it's overconfidence rather than nerves that cause Hrgovic not to pace himself well. Afro Jam says Joyce's footwork was okay. Never that great though. Bryant Jennings clearly used footwork and bodywork to beat Joyce and got robbed. Well, Joyce's footwork was good for a big man. And he used it well in the Dubois fight, as we saw. He used footwork, he used his jab, he used this little lean back, and he was blocking Dubois' shots with his right glove. Kyle said Vladimir had the same issue. Yeah, I think Hrgovic and Vladimir were totally different personality types. Like, totally different. Vladimir was a timid person inside. Externally, he would look confident and whatnot, but he was a timid person inside. That's why Vladimir wasn't aggressive. That's why he took his time in fights so much, because he didn't have confidence in his chin in particular. Hrgovic has got tremendous confidence in his chin. That's why he stood his ground, he held his feet, and he traded off with Dubois early. You know, Vladimir Klitschko wouldn't have been fighting Dubois like that. AJ didn't fight Dubois like that. Hrgovic was like, yeah, let's fight. Let's trade off in the middle of the ring. Dubois, let's go. He watched the fight back. There was no hesitation. There was no nerves about trading with Dubois. He was happy to do it. He wanted it. JR says he completely underestimated Triple D due to sparring. I think if they rematched, he would do much better. Hrgovic is still a top contender. Machiavelli says young Vladimir was a wrecking machine until he got chinned. I wouldn't say he was a wrecking machine. He had a pretty circumspect style. He was more aggressive than he was in his later career, yeah. But he had a more circumspect style than Hrgovic. He wasn't so right-hand happy and coming out with all the volume that Hrgovic comes out with. But he got beat by Ross Purity. That was his first defeat. His second defeat was Corey Sanders, who chinned him in a couple of rounds. And even in those fights, he didn't come out the way Hrgovic came out against Dubois, for example. In the amateurs even, Vladimir Klitschko's never really been aggressive, even early on in his career. He was more assertive. That's the way I'd describe him before he got chinned. He was more assertive earlier on in his career, but he was never out and out aggressive. Whereas Hrgovic is out and out aggressive. When he gets in there, he's throwing everything at you in the early going. Shazar says Saunders, it's actually Sanders, but yeah, Sanders, he says, gave Vlad PTSD. He did too. Striker says the thing is, he'll find Joyce slow and easy to hit, or so slow and easy to hit that he'll probably punch himself out at some point. He does tend to get a second win, but I think he'll have rocky moments in there. I tend to concur with your assessment. Yeah, I don't think it will necessarily be easy in there for Hrgovic because of the style and the engine of Joyce and the physical strength. Because I do think that Joyce is going to be the physically stronger fighter in there. Gino says a prime Shannon Briggs takes Daniel Dubois in 5. Well, he might, but if he doesn't take him in 5, Dubois will take him out later on for sure. Because speaking of poor stamina, Shannon Briggs always had terrible stamina. Always had terrible stamina. His first loss was to a guy called Darrell Wilson. And he came out like a freight train in the early going, punched himself out, and then got stopped. I think it was in the third or fourth round. Darrell Wilson stopped him. And Wilson was no great shakes. He was a small heavyweight too. By today's standards, just a cruiserweight. And that was a prime Shannon Briggs in his 20s. Stuck it on Darrell Wilson, punched himself out and got chinned in, like I say, 3 or 4 rounds. And then, of course, a few years later, when he fought Lennox Lewis, it was a similar thing. Came out fast in the early going, rocked Lewis with a left hook in the first round, but ran out of gas very quickly and got taken out. Dropped a bunch of times and stopped. Now, Vincent says, I don't think Hrgovic has enough power to really dent Joyce. I suspect it will be a long, grueling fight with either fighter taking a split decision. Yeah, I kind of concur with that assessment. I reckon it will be a relatively close decision, but I do think Hrgovic will get it. And yeah, as you say, Hrgovic may not have enough power to really dent Joyce. I would concur with that. Unless Joyce's chin is really diminished, then yeah, I reckon he'll struggle to hurt Joyce. But if you've seen the interview that Filip Hrgovic did with Box Nation, he seems ready to go the distance. He said, look, he's a very tough guy. If I don't knock him out, I'll definitely win on points. So, and he kept saying, I can win this fight on points. I can win. So he knows how tough Joe Joyce is. He fought him in the WSB. And that's a good mindset to have, you know, that this is going to go the distance, because there's a very good chance it will. Machiavelli says, remember how only 2 years ago Joyce was consensus #1 contender? Crazy. Well, I never really bought into the Joyce thing as far as him being this granite-jawed fighter, because I remember when he got chinned in the amateurs in 1 round by Sergey Kuzmin. And that wasn't when he was a young man. I think he was about 27. And I kept saying in my videos, if you've been boxing, whatever it was, 7, 8, 9 years by the time Joyce got chinned by Kuzman, you're 27. Your chin is not going to improve between the ages of 27 and 37. You know what I mean? You're going to have the same chin, if not a worse chin. And if he was getting ironed out by Kuzman in a round in the amateurs when he was 27, then I don't buy the idea he's got an iron jaw. He's got a good chin. Don't get it twisted. Definitely got a good chin. But it's not granite by any means. People were getting a bit too carried away with this Iron Man idea. Evil Uncle Phil says the Joyce hype train was Queensbury PR at its finest. Yeah, there was a lot of Queensbury PR, but there was also, to be fair, the fact that he did beat Daniel Dubois. And that wasn't in the Queensbury plan, was it? Queensbury were quite, and I'm talking about Frank Warren now, quite open in their bias in favor of Dubois going into the fight with Joe Joyce. Joe Joyce flipped the script. And he beat Daniel Dubois. And that win has aged really well, hasn't it? As has his win over Joseph Parker. So he did have legitimate good wins there. It wasn't all hype. But like I say, I think people just got a bit carried away with the whole chin thing. Blue Collar Sports TV says Hrgovic may have the better chin, certainly at this stage. Yeah, I was saying that before Joe Joyce got beat by Zhang. In several of my videos, I was saying, I think Hrgovic has got a better chin than Joyce. Because I'd seen Hrgovic take massive shots in the amateurs. I'd seen him take massive shots in the Zhang fight. And from what I could see, I was like, you know what? I think Hrgovic takes a better shot than Joyce. And I think we saw that play out in those Joyce-Zhang fights. Because Hrgovic stood up much better to Zhang's power than Joe Joyce did. And he was getting hit clean. He was getting hit very clean by Zhang, but he stood up to the shots. Shout out to Blue Collar Sports TV. KS says too long in the amateurs. I agree with that. Joyce spent too long in the unpaid ranks. Probably wasted his best years there, or a lot of his best years. The majority of his best years. JR says, I think the new generation of heavies won't be as entertaining as characters despite being talented inside the ring. Partridge, Wilder, White, Chisora have all given us a lot of laughs. Yeah, but it took a while for those guys to really become the characters that we know them as now. Fury was a character pretty much right off the bat, but Deontay Wilder wasn't much of a character at first. He was just this weird, kind of corny country guy who didn't really do much trash talk, and he was just weird. He wasn't, I guess you could say he was a character because he was strange, but he wasn't the Bomb Squad and to this day character that we would come to know. So he took a while to really find himself as a character. Dylan White, similar thing. He was boxing on small hall shows and this, that, and the other. If you see some of Dylan White's early interviews, he wasn't coming with all the banter and stuff like that. His interviews were a lot more serious. So he took a while to really develop as a character. Derek Chisora was a character from the beginning, but people didn't really get Chisora at first. You know, when he was fighting the likes of Danny Williams and then he kissed, what was that guy called? The guy from up north. Was it Baker? Forget his name now. I think his surname was Baker. People didn't really get him at first. I think it was really the, maybe the Hellenius fight, because he said he and his boys had a brawl with Hellenius, his security backstage. But really the Klitschko fight where he brawled with David Hay and whatnot. Obviously before that. He'd had the fight with Vitaly Klitschko. It was the same night, of course, as the brawl with Hay. So yeah, these guys took a while to really get that connection with the public, and they did a lot of interviews and so on and so forth. Sometimes these guys take a while to, they grow on you basically. Yeah, they grow on you. And they come out of their shell gradually. So I don't want to write off the new gen just yet in terms of characters. I mean, you might be right. Don't get it twisted, JR. You might be completely bang on. They might turn out to be dead characters. But I would say let's just give them some time. They're all very young, you know? Itama's only just 20. Richard Torres, what is he, 25? They're still finding themselves as men. They're still finding themselves as individuals. So, you know, give them some time. And oh yeah, somebody mentioned Pat Brown there. I saw the Pat Brown highlights of his pro debut. He is a promising UK cruiserweight who signed with Matchroom. I can see why he sold so many tickets and why he's popular. I think he's from Manchester, right? Pat Brown. He's got punching power there. I've seen some of his amateur bouts as well. And I'm not sure yet with Pat Brown. I need to see him in there against some challenging opponents. And don't get it twisted, that was a better debut opponent than most debutants would get because of the experience Pat Brown had in the amateurs. But, you know, pro boxing is a very, very tough game. Pat Brown got hit quite a few shots by the Argentine fighter in there. And we'll see how he holds up when he's getting hit with shots like that by much better fighters. But he does have some talent there. The hands are pretty quick. He likes to throw combinations. He likes to dig to the body. Yeah, good body punching. And he's definitely exciting and aggressive. So we shall see. Somebody asking if I saw Wilder's interview with 78 Sports. I haven't seen it. I've heard people talk about it, but I haven't seen it myself. Alex says it's crazy when you think about the fact that Joyce, after the Parker fight, seemed to be on top of the world, 2 defeats, and a year later, his career is completely off track. And that is an example of what I was talking about earlier on, where I said that when you become mandatory, you've fought your way into that position in most cases, right? You fought an eliminator, final eliminator, you've become mandatory. I've got no issue with you just treading water and taking on a few cream puffs and postmen until the mandatory gets called. I've got no issue with fighters doing that. That's what Joe Joyce should have done rather than taking on Zheli Zhang. He's just waited for his mandatory to be called, either sit on the shelf and not fight or have a few run-outs waiting for that mandatory. That's what he should have done. But he chose to roll the dice and fight Zheli Zhang, and it backfired horribly. Afro Jam says Wilder ruled out fighting AJ in 2025. To be honest, I don't blame him. I don't blame him because Deontay Wilder has looked even more shot than AJ has in his past couple bouts. So I don't blame him. There's a reason that Wilder is fighting a fan, and somebody pointed this out to me in the Element group, that Wilder's fighting somebody who once asked for a selfie with him a few years ago, because I've been posting that selfie on social media and sharing it everywhere. There's a reason why Wilder's fighting this guy in obscurity, and that's because his confidence is absolutely rock bottom. I mean, we saw that there was no confidence in the Parker fight. There was no fire. We saw there was no confidence in the Zhang fight. And that's 2 defeats. The guy has lost 4 of his last 5 fights. He hasn't won a fight for 3 years. Your confidence needs to be rebuilt after all that. Do you know what I mean? So as much as AJ looks washed, in the fights leading up to the Dubois fight, AJ at least looked confident. And he's had wins far more recently than Wilder has. Yeah. AJ won, when was it, last year? He won? Whereas Deontay Wilder hasn't won for 3 years. So I don't really blame him for not wanting to fight AJ later on this year, because his confidence is even lower than AJ's is. Shout out to Gorguga in the chat. Leo says, Hatman, do you think Valuev can win a belt in this era? No. Valuev was rubbish. Shout out to Adrian. Black Dynamite says, I think AJ's been able to have his skill bridge the gap where his confidence was missing. Wilder with no confidence or skills is in deep trouble. You put it very well. Because AJ does have a certain level of skill, athleticism, coordination, and balance and all that you can use to mask his lack of confidence against many opponents. Deontay Wilder doesn't have that level of technique and coordination and whatnot to fall back on. Stockholm says to me, Torres Jr. looks very overrated. Not to be pedantic, but I don't really think he's overrated because nobody's really singing his praises. Overrated means, the way I understand the word is the person is not as good as the general consensus would have you believe. I'm not aware of that many people even talking about Richard Torres. There's very little fanfare around him. So I couldn't really say he's overrated. He's not really being talked about much by anyone. In terms of him being, I guess, sloppy, yeah, he is. He does rush his work, all the things that you've said. Says Jelalov destroyed him. In the first fight that they had, yeah, he knocked him out horribly. But in the rematch, Torres was actually more competitive and he didn't get knocked out in the rematch. That was in the Olympics last time out. So I agree with your concerns regarding his sloppy approach and whatnot. But if you saw the last fight he had with Jelalov, he was a lot more cultured in there. He didn't just go rushing in. He was trying to box his way in close against Jelalov. And I think he's got that up his sleeve because of the amateur experience. When he wants to, I think he can be a lot more sensible with his approach. But whereby he's just been fighting journeymen, I suspect that's the reason why he's been so gung-ho. I could be wrong, we'll see. War Jones says, Hatman, who you got, Torres or Guido? I got Torres winning. It's a step up for Richard Torres against Vianello. But I think Richard Torres will be a bit too busy for him. And he'll get the job done. Maybe on points. Afro Jam says the rematch Olympic final was close. There you go. If you watch Torres in the Jelalov rematch, he does a lot better than he did in the first fight. And so to me, that shows that he's got more in the locker than meets the eye when you see him, being reckless against these journeymen. He's one of these guys that might fight to the level of his opposition. He was a vastly experienced, highly decorated amateur. So I think he's got more there than you might assume when you're watching him against whoever. The latest journeyman that he's fought. Shout out to Mr. Luca for the super chat. He says, Wilder versus White if it is made in December. Both guys are so shot to bits, it's unreal. I want to see how Wilder looks against this, somebody says bum fights. I want to see how Wilder looks against this fan that he's fighting. If they were to fight next, never mind December. If they were to fight next, I might actually go with Dillian Whyte, you know. I might actually go with Dillian Whyte. And I always, throughout both of their careers, said that Wilder knocks Dillian Whyte's head off. Stylistically, I always thought it was a terrible matchup for Dillian Whyte. I thought Wilder would knock his head off. But both guys are shot physically. Dillian Whyte still has confidence, though. Yeah, Dillian Whyte is very, very stubbornly confident. He has a very high natural level of confidence. Very alpha character, Dillian Whyte. So, if they were to fight next, let's say in 8 weeks' time, I'd probably pick Dillian Whyte, you know. And that's the first time at any point in their careers where I would have picked Dillian Whyte to beat Deontay Wilder. Black Dynamite says Whyte's confidence is actually remarkable. Yeah, he's got that hardcore Jamaican yardman confidence. That's what he's got. You know, growing up in Jamaica from a poor family, probably getting beaten from pillar to post by the people that raised him, getting in scraps with other kids all the time. He lost, and I'm making assumptions here, but so many Jamaicans that grow up in poverty fit this background. I think Dillian Whyte would have lost the feeling of embarrassment that comes with getting your butt kicked when he was very, very young. Because I think he got his butt kicked so many times, scrapping growing up, fighting with family members, getting beaten up by the adults in his family, and all that type of business. He would have lost the sense of embarrassment that comes with getting beaten up. And I think that as well as his genetics and whatnot, you know, some of our personalities are genetic. I think that combined with his genetics is why he's so confident and what have you when it comes to fighting. And how he's so undeterred by getting beaten up and knocked out. Because he's been taking beatings since he was a little kid, probably. Do you know what I mean? So it's not really a big deal to him the way it would be to a lot of other fighters. He was raised getting beaten up, so he's used to it. It doesn't bother him. It doesn't traumatize him the way it would most other boxers, you know? Carlton Palmer says, can Wilder still throw punches? Barely, right? Barely. But shout out to Mr. Luca for the super chat. Matt says, crazy to think 10 years ago Whyte had a decent chin. Yeah. It gradually deteriorated over a few years. There was the AJ knockout defeat, of course, but he still appeared to have a fairly decent chin even after he lost to AJ. But I want to say maybe the Chisora fights took something out of his punch resistance. And also the hard sparring behind the scenes, because Dillian Whyte is one of these guys who likes to spar like a madman. Gary says, why would he have that confidence? Why would he have that confidence? Okay, your English is terrible. Why would it have to be due to him being from Yard, blah, blah, blah? It could be... Oh, dear. You don't seem very intelligent if you can't discern the point I was making. There is a culture in Jamaica which is not only hardy, but also confident. And yes, in Africa, people get beat by their parents and Caribbean. I got beat by my mom, not so much my dad. But in many African countries, for one, there's not much boxing in most of them. And for two, there isn't really the fighting culture that there is in somewhere like Jamaica, particularly with the older generations. They would scrap it out, okay? So they were rougher than people from most African countries. How you haven't been able to discern this in all your life, I don't know. This is why you've had so many great fighters come from Jamaica over the years. Because they're a rough people. And they're a confident people. And kids grow up scrapping and whatnot. And they grow them tough. Not just in the ghettos in Kingston and Spanish Town, but even in country, they grow them tough. You've had so many fighters like Razor Ruddock, who also was very confident and tough. You know, went in there fearless against Mike Tyson. Mike McCallum. Trevor Berbick is another example. Yeah, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Trevor Berbick's attitude and his whole mindset was fearless. He wasn't a great fighter, but he was a fearless fighter, and that's typically what you get coming out of Jamaica. These guys are scrapping from when they're kids, and they have very hard lives. They're getting beaten from pillar to post by family members. It's tough. And I'm assuming Dylan White had the same upbringing as that, a very similar upbringing, a very tough upbringing. Darius says, I think you're wrong, Hatman. A lot of people, I'm not saying people from those countries don't have the same mentality. I don't know where you're going with this. You don't seem to be able to realize that I'm not saying that it's exclusively Jamaica. That's the only place where people grow up tough. I don't know why you're making that bizarre deduction. I'm just saying that Jamaica in particular, I'm not saying it's the only country where it can produce tough people. Weird that you're making such an assumption. Very weird. A shout to Black Dynamite. It says Fisher versus Wilder right now. Who you got? Fisher. Shout to Black Dynamite for the super chat. Machiavelli, shout out to you for the super chat. He says, how do you rate Larry Holmes' resume? You know, I've said so many times over the years that when you get these monolithic champions who reign for a long time, it's normally when the division is weak. And the Larry Holmes era wasn't the weakest ever era, but it wasn't the strongest by any stretch of the imagination. So his resume was, you can't blame him, right? Because he fought everybody there was to fight during his time. But it doesn't have the kind of names on it that Ali's resume had. I mean, to be fair, Ali's on Larry Holmes' resume, but he fought a completely washed up Ali with early stage Parkinson's. So we don't really look much into that. He did beat Ken Norton in a good fight, but again, that's Ken Norton coming to the end of his career. On paper, there is two best wins, right? Other than that, Ray Mercer, very late on in his career, was a decent win. But the other guys he beat, I mean, again, he beat some good fighters, but they were not like historically great fighters and standouts. He beat the Tim Witherspoons of the world and Trevor Berbick, obviously. Marvis Fraser. God, he beat so many people. Ronaldo Snipes. Ernie Shavers. Fought him a couple of times. Shavers wasn't a great fighter, truth be. He's a great puncher, but he wasn't a great fighter. Who else did he fight now? Carl the Truth Williams, who's a good boxer. So I would say that Holmes' resume, in my opinion, was better than Vladimir Klitschko's resume. But he didn't have a Muhammad Ali resume. He didn't have a Lennox Lewis resume, in my opinion. He didn't have, a resume as good as some of the other greats. But he was pretty good. Yeah, somebody mentioned Lennox Lewis there. I think it was Black Dynamite with regards to Jamaicans being tough, but Lewis wasn't raised in Jamaica. And Lewis didn't really have the kind of confidence that a yard man has. I mean, Lewis was confident, don't get it twisted, but he didn't have yard man confidence. Do you know what I mean? Shout out to Darry, he says, Hatman, I realize what you're saying. It's all love over here. I interpreted it wrong. It's all good, bro. It's all good. Yeah, Lewis didn't really have that yard man confidence. that you get from these guys that come from the trenches in Jamaica. Do you know what I mean? Whereas Dylan White has that. If you've been around Jamaicans and whatnot, you know what I'm talking about. The guys that come out of them trenches in Jamaica. They've got a certain, as I say, they've got a certain fearlessness that comes from being through everything pretty much that you could go through in life. So they're not embarrassed to take an L. You know, most people are embarrassed to take an L. And that's what prevents them from taking certain risks. But a man like Dylan White, he's like, I've been through everything in my life already, so I don't care. Let's roll the dice. Now, Blue Collar Sports TV says, who is the greatest what-if fighter in your opinion aside from Salvador Sanchez? I'd say Pirog or Ike Ibeabuchi. Maybe this is a controversial take. I might sling Tyson Fury in there. He's wasted away so much of his career being a donut and trying to hoodwink everybody. You know, binge drinking and blowing up in weight and doing all this stuff when he could have been fighting Anthony Joshua. He could have been fighting Usyk earlier. He could have fought so many of the contenders. You know? So I'm going to throw Tyson Fury in there as a what-if fighter. Because he's very talented, Fury. Very talented. But certainly Ibeabuchi's up there for sure. As Blue Collar Sports TV mentioned, Salvador Sanchez, Dimitri Pirog, yeah. Weird what happened to Pirog. You know, he just developed some kind of illness and then retired, never came back. Shout out to Kareem for the super chat. He says, Dylan looked so fat in his last fight. More than fat, he just looks slow, you know? Very slow. His left hook didn't have the same speed on it that he normally does. And because the speed was taken off it, it wasn't as powerful. It wasn't having the impact that we were accustomed to seeing. So, shout out to DC. He says, do you rate Sam Peter's career the Nigerian Nightmare? Not really. Sam Peter was eating too much eba and pounded yam, waddling around the ring. He showed some early promise, but once he started touching money, he was just living like a typical Nigerian married man. Eating too much eba and pounded yam and jollof rice. Shout out to James Clifford for the super chat. He says, do you think Deontay Wilder turning down $100 million to fight AJ on DAZN now with hindsight is actually an early symptom of the onset of CTE? I don't think so. I think it was a symptom of him just being an uneducated, foolish country bumpkin. You know, I don't want to stereotype here, but stats are stats, facts are facts. Alabama, I think, is like the lowest, if not one of the maybe 5 lowest states in America as far as education level and literacy. There's a lot of people that come out of Alabama. Obviously, not all the people, but there's a lot of people that are just straight up yokels and country bumpkins, and they're not very bright. Do you know what I mean? The ones in the cities are a bit more switched on, but the ones that are from little rural areas like Wilder or something, they're just not very bright, a lot of them. And that's, I think, a symptom of that for Deontay Wilder is turning down the AJ fight. He's a foolish man. Turning down the 100 mil. Evil Uncle Phil says, don't forget suya tastes amazing. Who next? Yeah, I remember that interview with Sam Peter. One of Sam Peter's best knockouts was when little Jacob says Sam Peter eventually started to look like Eba physically. Yeah, he did. He certainly had the Eba pounded yam belly. Yeah? He had a pounded yam belly. Waddling around the ring. Dari says, Hatman, would you say Lennox Lewis is probably still the best fighter of Jamaican heritage? Also, who are your favorite African fighters of all time? I would say it's close between Lennox Lewis and Mike McCallum. You might even give McCallum the edge. Overall, he's not as big a name as Lennox Lewis, but a lot of people would say McCallum was the better fighter. So you might give the edge to McCallum. And as far as my favorite African fighters of all time, if you're talking about African born, because there are so many fighters of African descent that have been really good over the years and still are. I mean, Nigeria is killing it right now with heavyweights, right, of Nigerian descent. Anthony Joshua, Moses Hitalma is half Nigerian and what have you. So Nigeria has been killing it with heavyweights over the years. In terms of the ones who were born in Africa, you've obviously got Azuma Nelson. He was a great fighter. You want to go way back in the days in the light heavyweight division, you had Dick Tiger from Nigeria. He was a great fighter. You had Baby Jake Matlala from South Africa. He used to do his thing. You had John the Beast Mugabe, obviously fought Marvin Hagler way back in the days. He was a good fighter. Ike Quartey, Ghana has produced some good fighters other than Azuma Nelson. You had Ike Quartey, who was exciting, aggressive, big puncher for Oscar De La Hoya and whatnot. Joshua Clottey, he was a bit of a disappointment for me. But I much prefer Ike Quartey, who was an aggressive fighter. Who else have you had out of Africa now? I'm trying to think. African-born fighters who became champions. I know there's been many, many more, but off the top of my head, I'm struggling. Little Jacob says Sam Peter used the combination of juju and power to dispose of his opponents. Speaking of Congolese fighters, right? This guy wasn't a great fighter, but he was a wild man and very, very strong. Much stronger than his size would suggest. And that was a guy who fought David Haye, very, very strong Congolese fighter. For some reason, I forgot his name right now. What was the guy who dropped David Haye? He was only like a super middleweight, light heavyweight. And he fought David Haye at cruiserweight, dropped him. A wild, wild fighter. I think he was Congolese. Lalenga Mock, thank you, Encircled. That's right, Lalenga Mock. Lalenga Mock. Now, Ian says Jean-Marc Mormac. No, Mormac is not an African fighter. He's from, is it Martinique? He's from the Caribbean. Yeah, Lalenga Mock, I think, was Congolese. He was a wild, wild fighter. Very strong. Very strong. Very, very strong. Yeah, it was a wild fight. It was a wild fight. Mock had that African warrior spirit in him. A fierce individual. Very wild and very fierce, Lalenga Mock. Proper African warrior. Saki Obika, forgot about him. He was WBC super middleweight champion, wasn't he? Was it middleweight or super middleweight where he held the WBC belt? He was from Cameroon, I think, Saki Obika. Of course, how can we forget Derek Chisora? Although Derek Chisora not a great fighter, but yeah, from Zimbabwe, of course. Stockholm says, Hatman, many claim that Fury is the most fluid heavyweight since Muhammad Ali. Do you agree with that? No. Not at all. Larry Holmes was more fluid than Tyson Fury. And there have been many others. Riddick Bowe was very fluid. Lewis was fluid. I don't agree with it at all. And Circle says Usyk is more fluid than Fury. Yep, Usyk exists. Carlton Palmer says Mock wasn't even supposed to be much of a puncher, and he had Hay hanging on for dear life. But you could see in the David Hay fight that Mock was incredibly strong. And he had a really fierce spirit. Some other African-born fighters would be Herbie Hyde. Again, wasn't a great fighter, but he did hold a version of the heavyweight title back in the days. Nigerian-born. He was one of these Nigerians that gets farmed. See, I had no idea about the whole farming thing. I had no idea about that. I grew up in the era where it was happening, but I had no idea that it was a thing, It's not something that Caribbeans were doing. We weren't doing none of that. But apparently loads of Nigerians were being farmed out and what have you. And in fact, Ade Oladipo was farmed. I think his family sent him to go live with an English family in Brighton. So they farmed him out, and yeah, I had no idea. No idea they were doing all that. And Herbie Hyde was also farmed. It's a strange word to use, but yeah. Blue Collar Sports TV says Sambu Kalambe was an excellent boxer. I think he was from Congo. Can't remember where Kalambe was from, but yeah, he was a good boxer. Fought McCallum, of course, got knocked out badly in a surprising defeat. I mean, not surprising that he lost, but the manner of the defeat was surprising against Michael Nunn. Nunn bombed him out in a round. Big left hand, and Kalambe was done for. Evil Uncle Phil says, farming is crazy, man. Don't get how Nigerians justified that move. It's insane. Well, Africans, let me tell you one of the differences between Africans and Caribbeans. I'm generalizing here, okay? One of the differences between Africans and Caribbeans is that even though Caribbeans are tough on their kids and they beat the kids and all that type of stuff, Caribbeans are more affectionate with their children than Africans in general tend to be. If you've ever had African friends, you're around African families and stuff like that, not all of them, but most of them that I've seen, they don't show much affection to their children. And they're very businesslike about the way that they do. They love their kids, but they're very businesslike about the way they deal with them. So, farming them out, it doesn't really shock me, because they're very, very cold and unaffectionate with their kids. As little Jacob said, they're uncompromising, yeah. Whereas Caribbean parents show more affection to their kids. They'll beat them up 1 minute, and then the next minute they'll be giving them a hug. Whereas the African parents just beat you up and there's no hugs. They don't do all the hugs and love and, all that type of stuff. They're standoffish. So, the farming thing doesn't really surprise me. Jay Silver says, yeah, seen that clip of KSI crying because his dad never hugged him. Yeah. It's the norm from what I've seen, There are many, many, many Africans that I've known and what have you over the years. The families don't really show affection to the kids. Ian says the most you'll get is sorry from Mumsy. Even that, I reckon, is pretty rare. Evil Uncle Phil says, yeah, affection deficiency in the African community is peak. Yeah, the Nigerian parents who are farming their kids out, it's just, they're looking at everything logically. As somebody said there, But then you have to ask, where does your kid stand a better chance? That's the way they look at it. They don't look at the trauma the kid might go through, being detached from the parents or any of that. They just look at it as a matter-of-fact thing. Well, they will learn the culture. They'll assimilate better if we farm them out to an English family. They'll understand how to interact with the locals better. They'll speak more like them. We'll get them, the education and whatnot. Not in the inner city, but in one of these small towns, which will probably be better than the kind of education they get in London, or what have you, London Comprehensive. So that's the way they look at it. It's purely, they take all the emotions out of it that the kid would go through. They take all of that out of it. And it's just like a purely logical mindset. Very transactional mindset. Mark Hatch says Eastern Europe is like that too. Yeah, I can imagine. Little Jacob says, my mom flogged the hell out of me 1 minute, then showed me affection the next minute. See, that's more like Caribbean parents. Yeah? Caribbean parents, especially Caribbean moms, they wear their heart on their sleeve. Caribbean moms are generally very warm. They will tear your behind up, right? If you step out of line, they will tear you up. But then they will hug you. They are affectionate generally. Caribbean moms are generally warm, much warmer than African moms. Evil Uncle Phil says, farming kids out to strangers like you're not getting these years back to bond with them seems to lead to resentment the way Ade speaks about it. You can tell many are unhealed. It's very tough. It's very rough. And I've heard Ade allude to issues that he's had, like mental issues and whatnot. Does that stem from being farmed out? I don't know. But it's very rough. It's very rough, I would have to imagine. And that's kind of one of the, in the black community in the UK, I don't think it's as pronounced as it used to be, but there was kind of a little division between Caribbeans and Africans back in the days. And there'd be a lot of Caribbean girls that wouldn't want to date African guys because they didn't want to meet the African parents, because African parents are different. You meet Caribbean parents and they're very warm, Caribbean parents are going to break out the rum. They're going to talk to you about where your parents are from, and it's usually a very warm experience. Not always. You do meet some who are standoffish and hardcore, but a lot of the time, they're warm, especially the mother. If you've been out with a Caribbean girl and you meet the mother's usually very big, gives you a big hug and all that type of stuff. Whereas you go meet an African parent, an African mom, it ain't nothing like that. You go meet an African girl's mom, and it is like the most hardcore, intense job interview you've ever been to. There's no smiling. They look at you with pure suspicion. They're asking you about your education background and all this stuff. That's how African parents are. As a Caribbean guy meeting an African parent, that's what they're like. There's no warmness or anything. It's like standoffish. So what education do you have? What degree do you, all that kind of business. Weird. Coming from a Caribbean background, you're not used to being interrogated like that, It's like literally like the French Inquisition, Spanish Inquisition. Yeah, it's like Spanish Inquisition. Got to meet most African parents. Indeed, have you completed university? That's the question. They look at you with so much suspicion. Especially when they know you're Caribbean, they're looking at you like, this boy. What do they call us now? Jamos. Even if you're not from Jamaica, they call you a Jamo. This Jamo boy. He's probably selling drugs. And Circle says, I can hear all these questions in a Nigerian accent and it's killing me. Yeah. Like, I knew a Nigerian girl. She was just a friend, like a platonic friend. And her mom didn't want her to associate with any Caribbeans at all. I mean, at all. Yeah. So, like, when she found out, like, she'd always question the daughter when she was talking on the phone. But this time, the daughter's in her 20s, early 20s. She'd be talking to me on the phone, and you'd hear the mom in the background. Who is that? Who are you talking to? And she'd always have to lie, but sometimes she'd hear a male voice and she'd be like, no, I know you're talking to that Jamaican boy. I don't want you speaking to him at all. And there was one time when I was actually round her house. Remember, me and this girl were just friends. There's no like extracurricular activity going on. I was round her house and the parents were supposed to be away for the weekend. And you know the classic thing where the parents come back unexpectedly, the mom and the dad. And her parents were like, she had like a proper battle axe of a Nigerian mom. The dad was kind of like subservient to the mom. He was one of them weird dynamics. You know in the old British sitcom, what's it called now? Keeping Up Appearances. You got like Hyacinth, who's like the domineering woman, and then Richard, who's like a kind of subservient husband. That's what her parents were like. They had a proper battle axe Nigerian mom. Anyway, I was in the house and then she suddenly looked out and she was like, oh my God, my parents are back. I didn't realize they'd be back so early. You got to hide. Because there was no way out. You know, there's only one exit from the house. So I had to go hide in the room upstairs and the mum's coming in, you know, saying this, that, and the other. But it was clear that they were not going to go. She tried to get them to go and, you know, saying whatever. In the end, I had to come out from the upstairs and face the parents. And the look on the mum's face, bro. She probably thought I was smashing the daughter upstairs. Do you know what I mean? Oh my gosh. When I had to come down and see the mum. Yo, anyway, after I left, obviously the girl was in big trouble and the mum was doing this and that and the other. And she told me that her mum said to her words to the effect of, your dad was terrified when you brought this Jamaican boy in our house. Your dad was scared. Oh my days. Yeah, that woman did not play at all. She did not play at all. Ayan says I would have burst out laughing. If you saw the look on her face, yeah, you would have burst out laughing. Little Jacob says matriarchal Nigerian household is an ominous sign. Yeah. DC says sounded like that scene from Don't Be a Menace. Yeah, something like that. But we were like on the, whatever it was, first floor, second floor. I didn't fancy jumping out the window. You know what I mean? From that height. Dari says, Hatman, I really think Jalalov hits harder than Wilder. I can see him being in tough fights in the coming years, but going to be giving these guys some nasty KOs. I agree. Well, I wouldn't say he necessarily hits harder than Wilder. I'm not sure, but I think he's definitely in the ballpark. Whether he hits harder or a bit less, I think he's in the ballpark, and he's a lot better technically than Deontay Wilder. Dr. Wu says, you should have pretended you were from British Gas fixing the boiler. I was dressed in like a shot hoodie. Do you know what I mean? With like Air Max TNs on and a baseball cap on. Yeah, I was not looking like somebody that was fixing any boilers. And predictably, you know, the mom was acting like I was some kind of drug dealer or something. Like, give me a break. Okay, Bank says, my mom's Nigerian and she's overly warming to all races. I appreciate she is one of the minorities, though. So generally speaking, Hatman, you're right. Yeah. She's a rarity. DC says, looking like Adventures of the Window Cleaner. Yep. Lincoln says, should have said you were doing Bible study. Yeah, she definitely wouldn't have bought that. You know, back in those days, I don't know if it's still the same now, but back in the 90s, early 2000s, I mean, some of these African parents, Nigerian parents in particular, they treated Caribbeans, like particularly Caribbean boys, men, like they were literally agents of the devil. You know what I mean? I don't know if you've seen the Adam Sandler movie Waterboy, where he's got some Bible thumping mum who's always talking about this is the devil and that's the devil, Bobby Boucher. Television is the devil, Bobby Boucher. Well, Nigerian mums used to act like Caribbean boys are the devil. They're literally sent by Beelzebub himself to corrupt their daughters and lead them down a path of destruction. Ayad says, the mum hates the water boy's girlfriend too. That's right. So, yeah, she was never going to buy the Bible study line. All right, peeps, I'm going to draw a close to this live stream. I'd like to shout out to everybody for joining me on this one. Been a great discussion. Talking boxing and some other stuff, as we always do. So, yeah. Until next time, you guys take care. Special shout out to everybody who donated via Super Chat. And, yeah, take care, be good. Try and take it easy. If you get it easy the first time, get it again. I'm out.